I've only seen a couple movies from this year, and normally at this point I wouldn't even bother trying to keep up, but with production shut down and theaters closed right now, I'm actually presented the rare opportunity to catch up on most of the films I've missed, and I've decided to do so in the form of a series of double features. I think my favorite thing about double features is that their primary function at this point is more theoretical than anything. It's way more common practice at this point to watch a movie, say, hey, this would make a great double feature with this other movie I've seen, and then never actually watch them as a double feature. That and the accidental double feature, where you watch two movies in close proximity and they inevitably have some similarities. It also makes the daunting list of movies that have come out this year more digestible for me. I can virtually have the list, and then I can break those double features into even more digestible installments because I'm not going to review 20 movies in a single video. And then once I've made 2 double feature videos, you can watch them back to back as a double feature. So as of today, I'm proud to announce this channel's very first double feature extravaganza. The actor double feature is probably the most common practice, aside from maybe the director double feature, but seeing as how we're doing 2020 films, I don't see myself doing the latter. Elisabeth Moss is a pretty great actor who's had some spotlight for a while now. I haven't seen either of her big shows yet, but maybe I'll watch them back to back as a double series. I did go through the Alex Ross Perry back catalog earlier this year, which I now realize are the only films I'd seen her in besides Us. But she's great in those, and delivers a wide variety of performances among them, really nailing these heavily vulnerable characters in a way that can be funny and empathetic, but surprisingly often quite unsettling. She brings an unhinged quality to the performances that I think the industry is really taking note of, or at least her agent. Both movies she's been in this year have been at least a little thrilling, and her performances do a lot of the carrying, especially in The Invisible Man. Now, I really wasn't crazy about The Invisible Man. It makes the really smart and interesting choice to make the subtext about the lack of support victims of abuse get from the police and even people close to them, which recontextualizes a lot of horror antics. They're just as frustrating as ever, but now that's the point, and that's something I'd normally be very into. But the problem with dumb horror antics is that they're fun to watch because they're so ridiculous. It's effective to a degree and does highlight the absurdity of the justice system, but it opens up an interesting filmmaking dilemma. The subtext of the film is almost contingent upon it being generic and ridiculous, because it's really sort of using the genre in general, and not so much its own specificities as an entry in that genre, so the ultimate result is a pretty forgettable film. The sets are just model homes and restaurants that are plainly lit. The score consists of a bunch of and it's framed with a lot of wides that are nice on the eyes, but don't quite save the film from looking bland. And for a genre like horror that relies so much on technique over text to immerse its audience, it kinda falls flat. But this begs the question, if it were more concerned with being a standout piece on its own from a technical perspective, would that diminish what it's trying to say about gaslighting? Of course, there are a lot of great films about gaslighting that don't rely on horror cliches and are artistically bold and iconic as singular works. Rosemary's Baby's the first example that comes to mind. But what's effective about that movie is mostly what's in the text as opposed to the subtext, which is what The Invisible Man is working with. And the irony is not lost on me that I'm comparing a movie about abuse to a movie directed by Roman Polanski, but unfortunately Rosemary's Baby is probably the most effective gaslighting movie I've seen so far. Anyway, the reason I say technique over text is because I find the term style over substance to be a bit dismissive to film as a craft, and is a big contributor to the stigma around horror being a lowbrow genre. They're 2 different tools, one of which happens to be more effective for the kind of immersion horror specializes in, so to call one of them substance is a pretty big oversight. And of course, a horror film can have both, and that's kind of where this elevated horror elitism comes from, but that doesn't mean that leaning toward one necessarily makes the whole thing bad. At the same time though, a film can still prioritize one to the detriment of the whole thing, and with horror, it's actually easier to hurt the film by leaning away from quote-unquote style than the other way around, which is kind of the problem with The Invisible Man, or at least part of it. But like I said, it does this really interesting textual or subtextual thing but ultimately what we have is a pretty unengaging film, and I don't know how much of that is just inherent to the approach, or how much of it could be dressed up a little more interestingly. The one thing that does keep the film as engaging as possible is Moss's performance, which is what really sells the effect of gaslighting and certain decisions her character makes as she gets pushed further and further, ending the film on a decently effective note. Ultimately, it's an interesting exercise, but there are a few too many aspects that held it back from resonating with me emotionally. Shirley, on the other hand, is a very different film. Hardly a thriller at all, though I get why people would call it that. It's equal parts romance and unease in every aspect, be it the performances, the production design, the score.
That was madness.
Or especially the characters' relationships, which is already an impressive feat on its own, but especially as a historical fiction about a real personality. It's hard to really describe the plot of Shirley, because it's partly about the artistic process, Shirley trying to write a book, partly a love square, our protagonist Rose dealing with her husband's infidelity and her budding relationship with Shirley, and about the domestic role she's kind of forced into, the mold of which Shirley and her husband Stanley have broken in an often unsettling way. But we see how all these things play into Shirley's complicated psychology and how that affects her work. So even though Rose is the protagonist with an arc, the movie's really a vignette of Shirley that's justified by Rose being the protagonist. It's a really tight web of 4 interesting characters, and the most engaging to watch, at least performance-wise, is actually Michael Stuhlbarg. He's kind of a facilitator for Shirley. He knows her system and the emotional consequences of certain things, and you can never get a full read on either of them, which is the most unsettling part of the movie. He's kind of in control and pulling the strings here, while she's a bit of a loose cannon, but her loose cannonisms also serve to pull the strings in Rose's marriage. It all seems really dubious and deceitful, but we eventually see how these actions are for the betterment of everyone. Except maybe Logan Lerman, but he kind of digs his own grave here. This facilitator, loose cannon dynamic is interesting because there seems to be a mutual understanding that the two have to lie to each other occasionally, for some reason or another, to maintain the system that is both their marriage and Shirley's work. This is where the unease comes from, because you don't fully trust anything that's happening, but there's a comforting catharsis to it, knowing it's an unconventional means to an end that's ultimately worth it. In many aspects, this tackles a lot of the same themes Phantom Thread tackles, so it's a little disheartening that there's so little buzz around it. There's a moment at the end that hits a note that's just as twistedly cathartic as the "kiss me before I'm sick" line, and I wish more people would experience that. The whole thing is edited with this almost improvisational feel that fits the jazz standards that play throughout, but in a more jagged and contradictory way that the score captures perfectly. It's admittedly a little hard to articulate because of how much of the emotion is contradictory and how the film sort of folds in on itself in that respect, but what you feel is very meticulously crafted and executed. There's a line where someone's talking to Shirley and she describes reading the lottery as
thrillingly horrible.
Here, thrilling is meant a little more upliftingly than in the genre term thriller, so thrillingly horrible pretty accurately conveys the conflicting emotion you feel. And you definitely get the sense that the writers wanted this to sort of describe the meta experience of watching the film, so I could say something about tooting their own horn, but if the horn deserves to be tooted, who am I to knock 'em? This horn definitely doesn't deserve to be tooted. The brass is cracking, costs more to repair than the instrument's worth. I shouldn't even be trying to play it for the video. Between the two films, there's not a whole lot of thematic overlap. They both have a thread about Moss's character's reclusiveness, and these are both kind of underexplored or barely addressed. There's that unhinged quality to her performances that I mentioned, and honestly I think her performance might actually be a little better in The Invisible Man. She's still great in Shirley, but there are a couple moments where it kind of actively feels like she's playing a historical figure, and other moments where something will happen to her that inspires her for the book, and maybe it's also how those scenes are edited, but they're a little corny. That said, they're not too bad, and they are sparse, and Shirley's definitely a more complicated character to play, so it's hard to definitively say the other performance is better. But aside from that, like I said, there aren't a whole lot of similarities between the two. I guess that's the problem when you watch two movies based on an actor and nothing else. Okay, never mind. When both of these movies had a scene where Pete Davidson tattoos a kid and then fights the kid's bald dad, I knew they were treading similar ground. Actually, I knew they were from the start, but I had no idea just how similar they would be. I don't know if he was just typecast in Big Time Adolescence, or if the role began to cater more to him once he was cast, but considering The King of Staten Island is about as close to an autobiography as we'll get from him, it's strange how similar Big Time Adolescence really is. I think Pete Davidson can be really funny, but mostly in small doses, so watching these two back to back, I think I kinda got my fill with him. That said, he can also handle dramatic scenes pretty well. Neither of these two are the most emotionally demanding films, but the only time he ever broke the illusion was actually in some of the comedic scenes. Big Time Adolescence is for the most part a pretty by-the-books coming-of-age film. An awkward but conventionally attractive high schooler tries to fit in with his peers and has a chance with a girl he likes, which sees a number of tribulations that risk the character's social status. This falls under the subgenre of coming of age, where the protagonist has a certain power or ability that elevates his status, and his ability to maintain that power is what threatens everything. In Superbad, it's supplying a party with liquor, in Charlie Bartlett, it's therapy, in Sex Education, it's sex therapy, and in Hot Summer Nights, it's drug dealing. I guess this would be a combo of Superbad and Hot Summer Nights, in that the main character is bringing liquor to parties and dealing drugs, and it's about how his slacker friend threatens his upward mobility in life, despite being the reason for his current social status in the first place. And admittedly, Davidson's character is where the film breaks off on its own route. I haven't really gone into spoilers with any of the films I've discussed yet, but I can't really talk about this film in a substantive way without doing so I'd recommend clicking away in the next few seconds if you haven't seen it. Or not. So, for a coming-of-age film, Davidson's character Zeke is a character who hasn't come of age and doesn't come of age. In Superbad, they both grow in the end and understand each other, but Zeke never understands anything. He does all these bad things, faces the consequences for them, and is just cool with it. Everything that happens to the main character Mo as a result of Zeke isn't resolved because he has to actually deal with the consequences, and instead of making amends or denouncing Zeke, they end on the uncomfortable terms of friends on paper, friends as far as Zeke knows, but we know that Mo's gonna blow off the shaky plans they make, and the plans they make after that, and so on. So internally, he's grown out of it and come of age. The final shot is him driving away from Zeke, moving forward in life while Zeke stays in the exact same place. Which is a pretty authentic note to end the film on. I think we can all relate to guiltily stringing someone along because we don't have the heart to cut things off, even if the friendship is unhealthy. Or at least I hope we all can. And I think we all also went to high school with someone with no aspirations, perfectly content working a dead-end job to pay for their grimy lifestyle. And on one hand, there's nothing wrong with pulling minimum wage to afford the lifestyle you want to live, but when it comes at the expense of all your relationships and you hurt everyone you get close to, something has to change. But some people don't change, and that's what this film is about. So because it ends on this really effective note, it left a pretty good taste in my mouth. But looking back at the core of the film, a lot of it goes by a bit unmemorably. The structure's pretty tight, establishing a status quo of Zeke and Mo hanging out at the house or on errands, Mo's parents becoming gradually more frustrated, and then the few parties that serve as milestones or chapters for the film to keep momentum and build on itself. And even the relationship is developed pretty organically, but I guess the only word I can call most of the film is vanilla. It's tough to criticize, because it's mostly good, and it mostly does its job, but I feel like coming of age in particular is a genre that almost always yields solid results by just adhering to the established structure as rigidly as possible, so I feel like eventually you have to do something different with it. This is why the end is so effective, and like The Invisible Man, it begs the question, if the bulk of it weren't mostly by the books and a bit generic, would that one difference be as effective? Aside from that, a couple scenes where Zeke is actively not taking accountability delve into self-parody and feel like the Chad character from SNL, which doesn't totally fit how authentic the rest of the movie feels, but for the most part, the film is effective in driving home its central thesis, and overall, it was better than I expected. The King of Staten Island was actually also better than I expected, but only because the trailer gave me really low expectations. Some of the movie is exactly what you'd expect from a one-step removed Pete Davidson biopic, like it bookends itself with Kid Cudi songs. A lot of the jokes don't land here, or maybe I just had Pete Davidson fatigue while watching it, but it does establish a good sense of community, both geographically and with the characters' relationships. What makes this a bit hard to criticize is that coming of age isn't really a genre that relies on unpredictability or suspense to keep the audience invested, but there is something to be said for knowing exactly how a certain plot thread will play out as soon as the conflict is established, which is the case with most of the threads in this movie. It's also interesting in the meta. I know I said these weren't very emotionally demanding roles, but this had to have been a cathartic experience for him, so you feel a sense of good for him while watching it, which raises questions about how self-contained a film has to be for it to be good, or if you can enjoy a film for reasons outside of the narrative. This ties into the whole separating the art from the artist discussion, but in a much less uncomfortable context. The most common complaint about this movie, and of Judd Apatow in general, is that it's a bit too long, and I was honestly on board with the pacing for the most part, and I guess I have to go into spoilers again. But the sort of second act low point in this movie, Scott getting kicked out of his house, doesn't so much resolve or enter into a third and final act as it does start a whole new film where he joins the firehouse. This of course resolves the conflict established with the firefighters earlier in the film, and is the whole catharsis of Scott accepting his father's death, but it really has its own full 3-act structure, and is kind of a hero's journey in and of itself. This leads to Scott fixing the other aspects of his life, except his friends who go to jail for robbing a convenience store, and that's about it for them. I guess they serve the cautionary role Zeke served in Big Time Adolescence, and it ends with Scott, the fail son, finally coming of age and moving on with his life. The firehouse stuff does feel authentic, but yeah, considering the scope of the rest of the film, I'm not sure how much it benefits from the pacing here. I guess it's a trade-off. So even though these two films are remarkably similar, or I guess because they're so similar, they foil each other in an interesting way. Big Time Adolescence is kind of by the books throughout in terms of setting and conflict, but ends on an unconventional note that ties the whole thing together really well. And The King of Staten Island chugs along in its relatively unique setting. Staten Island is pretty untapped in movies, which makes the core pretty memorable, but it ends its plot threads on pretty conventional notes. So it's really Big Time Adolescence that I find myself thinking of more often. Staten Island ties itself up neatly in a ribbon that makes it another solid entry in the genre, and though most of Adolescence feels that way, the ending does have a lot of significance and is what makes it stand out a little bit in the genre. But again, considering the context of Staten Island and how much it relates to Davidson's own life, I get why ending on such an uplifting note was the right move and cathartic for him. As an Elizabeth Moss, Pete Davidson double feature, I guess the only thing this really proved is that sometimes an actor tackles similar themes in their work, and sometimes they don't. They are actors, after all. Elizabeth Moss continues to work her way into becoming a household name or an A-lister, if she wasn't both of those things already, and Pete Davidson is off to a pretty strong start as a lead actor. Hopefully as he continues, he'll develop a little more range, but I can't really knock him for being in two similar movies, and he plays his type well, so who am I to complain? This whole double feature extravaganza is a format I'd like to keep up moving forward, and even in subsequent years, so if you have any feedback, I'll gladly take it. Let me know in the comments. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.